My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. I wanted to do something monumental for my parents' 30th wedding anniversary. I built them a $3 million lakefront mansion. It was supposed to be a grand surprise. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw valet parkers taking luxury cars. I saw caterers carrying trays of champagne. And I saw a massive banner hanging from the front portico. It read, "Terrence's Real Estate Wealth Seminar." Terrence is my brother-in-law. He did not own this house. I did. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our family meant projecting an image of privilege and perfection to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary in a prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's. I joined honor societies. I earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university. But nothing I ever achieved earned my parents' true approval. That validation was reserved entirely for my older sister, Desiree. She was the golden child. The former sorority queen who could do absolutely no wrong. While I was the quiet nerd sitting at a computer learning how to code, Desiree was the social butterfly. When she married Terrence, my parents acted like she had secured the future of our entire bloodline. My parents viewed Terrence as the ultimate success story. He proudly called himself a cryptocurrency and real estate entrepreneur. They worshipped the ground he walked on. They loved his tailored suits and his leased luxury cars. I knew from the very beginning that he was nothing but smoke and mirrors. I recognized the signs of a man drowning in debt while trying to look wealthy. But I kept my mouth shut and focused entirely on my own career. I quietly built my software development firm from the ground up. I invested my money wisely in private equity and real estate. I became genuinely wealthy while my sister and her husband just pretended to be. I thought that buying this mansion for my parents would finally prove my worth to them. I thought it would be the ultimate gesture of forgiveness and love. The lakefront mansion was my absolute masterpiece. I spent 2 entire years designing every single inch of it for my parents. I personally chose the custom imported marble floors in the grand foyer. I selected the crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceilings. I even had a custom chef's kitchen installed because my mother used to love cooking before she became completely obsessed with maintaining her social status. I sent the keys to my parents a week early with a handwritten note saying I had a special surprise for their anniversary weekend. I drove 4 hours from my home in Chicago, expecting to see them crying tears of joy on the front porch. Instead, I was met by a valet attendant in a crisp uniform. He stepped up to my car and politely asked for my keys. I stared at him in complete disbelief. I rolled down my window and asked him what event was happening at this address. He smiled professionally and told me it was an exclusive investor retreat hosted by the CEO of Terrence's company. My stomach turned completely upside down. I refused to hand over my keys. I parked my car on the grass near the edge of the property. I did not care if the tires ruined the pristine landscaping that I had just paid thousands of dollars to install. I walked up the grand stone steps of the house I legally owned. I pushed open the heavy, solid mahogany front doors. The massive foyer was packed with people in expensive tailored suits and cocktail dresses. Smooth jazz music was playing softly from the built-in surround sound system I had personally wired. Waiters in white gloves were walking around offering expensive appetizers on silver platters. And then I saw her. Desiree was standing near the bottom of the grand curved staircase. She was wearing a designer silk dress that I knew she could not afford. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne and playing the role of the perfect wealthy hostess. She was laughing loudly at a joke someone made. When she turned her head and saw me standing in the doorway, her fake smile instantly vanished. Her eyes widened in panic. She excused herself from the group of investors and marched directly over to me. She grabbed my arm with a tight, painful grip. Her voice was a harsh, desperate whisper. She asked me what on earth I was doing here. She said, "Mom promised me you were not coming this weekend." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm and calmly told her to let go. She dropped her hand but quickly stepped closer to completely block my path into the living room. She looked me up and down with that familiar expression of total disgust. It was the same look she gave me when we were teenagers. She told me I was going to ruin everything. She said Terrence was pitching to the biggest real estate investors from Atlanta today. She told me this was a multi-million-dollar networking event, and I simply did not belong in a room with these high-caliber people. She said I always had to ruin her husband's big moments with my bitter and negative energy. I just stared at her face. I asked her if she had any idea whose house she was currently standing in. She rolled her eyes dramatically. She said Terrence bought this magnificent property as his new corporate headquarters. She told me Terrence was doing massive things for the family legacy, while I was just a single lonely woman sitting in a dark cubicle writing computer code all day. The sheer audacity of her words was actually comical. She truly believed her husband was a powerful mogul. She was completely convinced that his business was legitimate. She had absolutely no idea that I held the deed to the very marble floor she was standing on. She leaned in closer and told me I needed to go back to the kitchen and stay with the catering staff. She said I could help them plate the food so I would remain completely out of sight. She told me my presence was an embarrassment, and I would scare the wealthy investors away. She reminded me that I was never good in social situations anyway. Every single word that came out of her mouth was carefully designed to make me feel small and insignificant. It was the exact same way she treated me our entire lives. Whenever her popular friends came over to our childhood home, she would force me to stay hidden in my bedroom. My parents always allowed it to happen. They always protected Desiree's pristine image over my emotional feelings. But I was not a helpless teenager anymore. And this was not our parents' house. This was my $3 million property. I did not yell or scream at her. I did not cause a massive scene in front of the important guests. I knew that reacting with anger would only give her the exact reaction she desperately wanted. She wanted me to look like the crazy, jealous little sister. So I simply smiled at her. It was a calm and utterly terrifying smile. I slowly looked around the beautiful foyer. I admired the intricate crown molding I had fought the demanding contractors over. I looked back at Desiree and told her she looked lovely in her expensive dress. She seemed completely confused by my calm and collected demeanor. She opened her mouth to hurl another insult, but I simply stepped right around her. I told her I was going to find Mom and Dad. Desiree suddenly panicked. She desperately tried to step in front of me again, but I just kept walking forward. The house was massive, but I knew the architectural layout perfectly. I walked away from the crowded living room and headed down the long, quiet hallway toward the private back study. The loud noise of the party slowly faded away as I walked deeper into the house. I fully expected to find my parents relaxing comfortably in the study. But as I approached the heavy oak doors, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was slightly cracked open. I could hear hushed voices inside. I reached out my hand to push the door open, but the terrible words I heard coming from inside that room made my blood run completely cold forever. I stood completely paralyzed in the hallway, listening to the voice of my mother coming from inside the dimly lit study. She was pacing back and forth across the imported Persian rug. Her voice was trembling with a mixture of anxiety and annoyance. She told my father that if I showed up and found out they gave Terrence the keys, I was going to throw a massive temper tantrum. She actually called it a temper tantrum. I just spent $3 million building them a custom retirement estate, and she was reducing my potential reaction to a child throwing a fit. Then I heard my father reply, the great Reverend Thomas, a man who stood at the pulpit every single Sunday, preaching about honesty and integrity. He sighed heavily and told my mother to stop worrying. He said that I was always too emotional and that I needed to understand the bigger picture of family wealth. He said Terrence was on the verge of a massive breakthrough and that my little house was serving a much higher purpose today. My little house. That is what he called a $3 million custom-built mansion, a higher purpose. That is what he called a fake real estate seminar orchestrated by a man drowning in debt. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The heavy brass hinges let out a soft click that echoed in the quiet room. My parents both jumped in their leather chairs. They spun around to face the doorway. They looked exactly like two guilty teenagers caught trespassing in a place they did not belong. The study was supposed to be my father's grand sanctuary. I had spent months sourcing rare mahogany wood for the custom bookshelves. I had a beautiful brick fireplace installed so he could sit and read his theology books in peace. Instead, he and my mother were hiding in the shadows with the lights turned off, so none of the wealthy investors outside would see them. They were the guests of honor for a 30th anniversary surprise, but they were cowering in the dark. My mother Brenda gasped and clutched her pearl necklace. Her eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route. She quickly rushed over to me and grabbed my hands. Her palms were sweating. She immediately raised her finger to her lips and shushed me. She actually shushed me in my own house. She begged me to keep my voice down. She said I was going to ruin everything if Terrence heard me out here. I pulled my hands away from her tight grip. I asked her very calmly what exactly she thought she was doing. I asked her why she and Dad were hiding in the dark while Terrence's fake investors were drinking my expensive champagne and walking all over my custom marble floors. My father stood up from his leather armchair. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his authoritative pastor voice on me, the same voice he used to intimidate me when I was a little girl. He told me to lower my tone and show some respect. He said I had absolutely no right to storm in here and disrupt a crucial business transaction. I stared at him in utter disbelief. I asked him if he had lost his mind. I reminded him that I mailed those keys to him and Mom as a 30th anniversary gift. I told him this entire estate was built with my own money to give them a peaceful place to retire. My mother stepped between us. She put her hands on my shoulders and tried to give me a comforting smile, but her smile was completely hollow. It was the same manipulative smile she used whenever she needed me to sacrifice something for Desiree's happiness. She told me I was being overly dramatic. She explained that Terrence was just in a temporary cash flow bind. She said the real estate market was very tough right now, and his company just needed a tiny little boost to secure a massive round of funding from those Atlanta investors. She said Terrence saw the pictures of the house I sent them, and he begged them to let him use it for just one afternoon. She told me he just needed a grand location to host his seminar so he could fake it till he makes it. Fake it till he makes it. I repeated those words slowly, letting them hang in the quiet air of the study. I asked her if she realized how insane that sounded. I asked her why my massive financial achievement was being used as a prop to prop up a man who had never worked a hard day in his life. My mother let out an exaggerated sigh. She looked at me like I was a massive disappointment. She crossed her arms and launched into the exact same guilt trip she had used on me for my entire adult life. She lowered her voice and told me that as a successful Black family, we have a strict duty to protect our men. She said the world is already hard enough on Black men trying to build wealth, and that Terrence was simply trying to establish a generational empire for Desiree and their future children. She told me that since I was single and had no family of my own, I could not possibly understand the immense pressure Terrence was under. She said it was my duty as a sister to step aside and let him shine. She said I should be proud that my property was helping elevate a Black man to the next level of corporate success. I felt a wave of pure nausea wash over me. The emotional manipulation was so incredibly toxic that I could physically feel it in my chest. She was weaponizing our culture and our race to excuse the fraudulent behavior of her favorite son-in-law. She was actively telling me that my hard work, my money, and my success meant absolutely nothing compared to the fragile ego of a man who was lying to everyone in the living room. I had spent years working 80-hour weeks fighting my way up the corporate ladder in the software development industry. I faced discrimination, isolation, and endless stress to build my fortune. But in my mother's eyes, my money was just a convenient tool to be handed over to Terrence so he could play pretend. My father chimed in right on cue. He told me to stop being so selfish. He said the Lord blessed me with a good corporate job so I could be a blessing to my family. He told me that keeping this house all to myself just to show off was a sin of pride. He actually looked me in the eye and said Terrence had the vision to use this house for community wealth building while I only cared about my own personal comfort. The absolute delusion was staggering. They had convinced themselves that Terrence was some kind of financial savior, and that I was the greedy villain for wanting my anniversary gift to be used as an anniversary gift. I looked back and forth between the two of them. I saw the absolute desperation in their eyes. They were completely brainwashed by the image Terrence projected. They cared more about maintaining the illusion of Desiree's perfect marriage than they cared about the reality of my love and dedication. I had spent $3 million trying to buy the love and approval of two people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it to me. They did not see me as their daughter. They saw me as a bank account to fund the golden child's lifestyle. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was the absolute clarity that comes when a lifelong illusion is finally shattered. I realized I was never going to win their love. I was never going to be enough. And in that moment, the last remaining shred of guilt I held toward my family completely vanished. I looked at my mother and told her that protecting a liar does not build a family empire. It destroys it. She opened her mouth to scold me again, but I simply turned my back on her and walked over to the large bay window at the far end of the study. The window offered a perfect view of the sprawling backyard and the massive lake behind the house. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I was preparing to turn around and tell them exactly what I was going to do next. I was preparing to walk out into that living room and publicly humiliate Terrence in front of every single investor. But as I looked out through the glass, something caught my eye. There was a man walking around the perimeter of the backyard. He was not wearing a tailored suit like the investors inside. He was wearing a casual polo shirt and holding a digital tablet. He had a professional digital camera hanging around his neck. I watched closely as he crouched down near the foundation of the house. He meticulously took several close-up photos of the concrete base. Then he stood up and pointed his camera toward the custom slate roof. He took several more photos, logging notes into his tablet after every single shot. He was inspecting the property with a terrifying level of detail. I knew exactly what that meant, because I work in commercial real estate investment. He was not a party guest. He was not a caterer. He was an independent property appraiser. And property appraisers only show up for one reason. Someone was trying to take out a massive loan against the house. My stomach dropped completely to the floor. Before I could turn around and demand an explanation, my father spoke from the shadows behind me. My father stepped out of the shadows and told me in his sternest preaching voice that I needed to make a choice. He said I could either go out to the kitchen and make myself useful, or I could get back in my car and drive all the way back to Chicago. He told me he would not allow my petty jealousy to ruin his son-in-law's big day. I did not even bother turning around to face him. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. My eyes were completely locked on the man outside the window. Whatever my father thought was happening today was entirely wrong. Whatever Terrence had told them was a massive lie. I reached out and unlocked the heavy brass latch of the French doors that led from the study directly onto the back patio. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, completely ignoring my mother's frantic whispers behind me, demanding that I come back inside. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of the study. The backyard was quiet except for the gentle sound of the wind blowing across the surface of the lake. I took a deep breath of the fresh air and immediately focused my attention on the man with the camera. He was standing near the edge of the custom stone retaining wall I had installed just last month. He was holding a laser measuring tool against the brick foundation and logging the numbers into his digital tablet. He was moving with the precise, calculated efficiency of a seasoned professional. I walked slowly across the manicured lawn, making sure the heels of my shoes clicked loudly against the stone pathways so I would not startle him. As I approached, he heard my footsteps and turned around. He lowered his digital tablet and let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and smiled at me. He said he was incredibly glad someone from the administrative team finally decided to come outside. He told me he had been knocking on the front door for 20 minutes, but the valet and the caterers completely ignored him. He extended his hand and introduced himself as Arthur Sterling. He said he was the senior commercial property appraiser sent over from Metro Financial Services. I shook his hand firmly and gave him a polite, professional smile. I did not correct his assumption about who I was. I knew that if he thought I was Terrence's personal assistant or an event coordinator, he would speak to me much more freely. I apologized for the confusion at the front door. I told him it was a very chaotic day, with the investor seminar happening inside. I asked him how his inspection was going, and if he needed any specific documents from our team to complete his file. Mr. Sterling let out a frustrated chuckle and shook his head. He looked down at his digital tablet and scrolled through a dense spreadsheet. He told me that this entire situation was highly irregular. He said he had been an appraiser in this county for over 20 years, and he rarely saw emergency rush orders like this one. He explained that Terrence had called his firm in an absolute panic yesterday morning, demanding a 24-hour turnaround on a comprehensive property valuation. He said Terrence paid a massive premium fee to have an appraiser sent out on a Saturday afternoon. I kept my expression perfectly blank, but my mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. A 24-hour rush appraisal is an extremely expensive and desperate move. People only request those when they are facing an immediate, devastating financial deadline. I nodded sympathetically and told Mr. Sterling that Terrence was always a man in a hurry. I asked him casually what the final estimated valuation was looking like for the property. Mr. Sterling tapped his screen a few times and looked up at the massive structure of the house. He let out a low whistle of genuine admiration. He told me that whoever built this estate spared absolutely no expense. He noted the imported slate roof, the reinforced foundation, and the high-end custom windows. He said conservative estimates place the current market value right around $3.2 million. He said that valuation was more than enough to comfortably cover the loan Terrence was applying for. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I kept my voice incredibly steady and asked him to clarify the exact amount of the loan. I pretended to be double-checking the figures from my administrative records. Mr. Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He stated clearly that Terrence was finalizing a hard money collateralized loan for exactly $1.5 million. He said the paperwork was drawn up and waiting for the final appraisal signature to release the wire transfer by Monday morning. The sheer scale of the fraud hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Terrence was not just using my house as a fancy backdrop to trick some local investors into giving him startup capital. He was actively using the physical property as direct collateral to secure a massive corporate loan. He was trying to extract $1.5 million in pure cash, based entirely on the value of the real estate I had built with my own money. If he defaulted on that loan, which he inevitably would given his fake business, the lender would have the absolute legal right to foreclose on the mansion and seize the property. Terrence was attempting to steal my $3 million investment right out from under me, and he was doing it right in the middle of a party he threw to celebrate himself. The audacity was so staggering it almost felt surreal. He actually believed he could get away with it. I crossed my arms to stop my hands from shaking. I had to force myself to breathe evenly. I knew exactly how commercial real estate law worked. I deal with multi-million-dollar property acquisitions every single day in Chicago. For Terrence to even get to the appraisal stage of a commercial loan, he had to have submitted a massive stack of legal documentation to the lender. A bank does not simply send out an appraiser because you ask them to. You have to prove absolute legal ownership of the asset you are putting up for collateral. Terrence had to have provided a property deed, a title insurance policy, and legally binding signature authorizations. But I held the original deed in a secure safety deposit box under the name of my private company. That meant Terrence had committed multiple federal felonies. He had committed wire fraud. He had committed title forgery. He had submitted fraudulent legal documents to a financial institution. I looked back at Mr. Sterling, who was currently taking a photo of the back patio layout. He was just a guy doing his job, completely unaware that he was standing in the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy. I knew I needed just one more piece of critical information before I walked back into that house and burned Terrence's entire world to the ground. I needed to know exactly how he forged the ownership documents. I put on my best confused assistant face. I tilted my head and told Mr. Sterling that there must be a slight clerical error in his system. I told him that as far as I knew, the property was not registered directly under Terrence's personal name. I asked him if he could quickly verify exactly whose name was listed as the primary legal borrower and the registered property owner on the loan application approval forms. Mr. Sterling sighed and clicked a few buttons on his tablet to pull up the master file. He said the title company had verified the documents yesterday afternoon, so everything should be perfectly in order. He adjusted his glasses and read the screen carefully. He said the property was originally purchased and developed by an out-of-state limited liability company, but there was a recent transfer of power. He scrolled down further to read the specific authorization notes. He told me that the loan was not in Terrence's name alone. He said the primary borrowers listed on the $1.5 million promissory note were Reverend Thomas and Brenda, my parents. My stomach dropped completely into a bottomless black hole. The breath was knocked out of my lungs so hard I had to take a step back and grab the stone wall to steady myself. Mr. Sterling continued reading, completely oblivious to my reaction. He explained that according to the legal file, Terrence had submitted a fully notarized power of attorney document. The document explicitly granted Terrence the absolute legal authority to leverage my parents' financial assets. Terrence had not just forged a deed to my house. He had somehow convinced my parents to sign a document that made them the primary financial guarantors for a $1.5 million shadow loan. He was using their names, their credit, and their signatures to take the money. If the loan went into default, Terrence would walk away with the cash, while my parents would be left holding the bag. The lender would not just take the mansion. They would go after every single penny my parents owned. They would take their retirement funds. They would take my father's church pension. They would take the small house they currently lived in. Terrence was actively destroying their entire financial existence, and they were hiding in a dark study protecting him. I thanked Mr. Sterling for his time. My voice sounded completely hollow to my own ears. I turned away from him and stared at the back of the beautiful house I had built with so much love. The sheer evil of what Terrence was doing was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. He was a financial predator, and he had chosen his own in-laws as his primary victims. He had manipulated their blind love for Desiree and turned it into a weapon to bankrupt them. I felt a cold, hard rage settle deep into my bones. There was no more sadness. There was no more disappointment. There was only a burning desire for absolute destruction. I walked back toward the French doors of the study. I was no longer the discarded daughter seeking approval. I was the executioner, and I was going to tear his fake empire apart brick by brick. I grasped the heavy brass handles of the French doors and pushed them open. The air inside the study felt stagnant and suffocating compared to the crisp wind outside. My father, Reverend Thomas, was aggressively pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. His hands were clasped firmly behind his back in his classic pastoral stance. My mother, Brenda, was sitting stiffly on the edge of the leather sofa, wringing her hands in obvious distress. They both stopped and stared at me as I closed the glass doors behind me. The click of the latch echoed loudly in the quiet room. My father immediately puffed out his chest. He prepared to deliver another blistering lecture about my lack of family loyalty. He opened his mouth to speak, but I completely cut him off. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply walked over to the heavy oak desk and stared directly into his eyes. I demanded to know exactly what piece of paper he had signed for Terrence last week. My father blinked in surprise. He was clearly taken aback by my sudden change in demeanor. He was used to me either shrinking away in silence or crying when he raised his voice. He was not used to me speaking to him with the cold authority of a corporate executive. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He demanded to know what on earth I was talking about. He told me my tone was completely disrespectful and that he would not tolerate being interrogated in his own space. I placed my hands flat on the smooth surface of the oak desk and leaned forward. I told him this was not his space. I reminded him once again that this was my house. I told him I had just spoken to the commercial property appraiser wandering around the backyard. I told him the appraiser was finalizing the collateral valuation for a $1.5 million hard money loan. I watched my father's eyes dart nervously toward my mother. He tried to maintain his authoritative posture, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. I asked him again, point blank, what legal documents he signed for Terrence. My mother let out a small gasp and covered her mouth. She looked up at my father with wide, terrified eyes. My father slammed his fist down on the desk in a pathetic attempt to regain control of the room. He told me I was being completely hysterical. He said I was misunderstanding a very simple administrative process. He adjusted his suit jacket and lifted his chin. He told me Terrence had approached him a few days ago with some standard legal paperwork. He said Terrence was simply trying to protect the family assets. My father explained that because I lived out of state in Chicago, I was legally vulnerable to heavy property taxes and out-of-state transfer fees. He said Terrence had graciously offered to handle all the complicated legal logistics of the property transfer so my parents could enjoy their anniversary gift without any financial burden. My father looked at me with a sickening sense of righteous pride. He said Terrence brought him a standard power of attorney document. He claimed Terrence needed the signature just to legally accept the gifted house on my behalf. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. The sheer stupidity of his explanation was almost impossible to comprehend. My father was a man who had built a massive congregation. He negotiated church property contracts. He was not an uneducated man. But his blind adoration for his son-in-law had completely overridden his basic common sense. I asked him if he actually read the document before he signed his name. I asked him if he had a lawyer review the power of attorney before he handed over complete legal control of his financial existence. My father scoffed loudly. He acted as if my question was highly offensive. He told me that family does not need lawyers to deal with family. He said Terrence was a successful businessman who understood the complex real estate market far better than I ever could. He said Terrence assured him the document was just a temporary formality to expedite the deed transfer. My father stood tall and proudly declared that he trusted Terrence implicitly because Terrence was a man of God and a devoted husband to Desiree. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in the back of my throat. I shook my head and walked around the desk to stand right in front of him. I decided it was time to shatter his delusions completely. I stripped away every ounce of emotion from my voice. I spoke to him the same way I would speak to a naive client who had just been scammed out of their life savings. I told my father that a power of attorney does not just allow someone to accept a gift. I explained that signing a general financial power of attorney gives another person the absolute legal right to act as you in every single financial capacity. It gives them the power to empty your bank accounts. It gives them the power to sign legally binding contracts in your name. And most importantly, it gives them the power to pledge your personal assets as collateral for massive corporate loans. My father's face began to lose its color. His confident posture started to crumble just a fraction of an inch. But his massive ego refused to let him fully process the reality of my words. He shook his head stubbornly. He said Terrence would never do something like that. He said Terrence was securing a business loan using his own successful company. I stepped closer and looked him dead in the eye. I told him Terrence has no successful company. I told him Terrence's business is a complete sham, built on leased cars and maxed-out credit cards. I explained that no reputable bank would ever lend Terrence a single dollar. That is why Terrence had to go to a shadow lender for a hard money loan. And because Terrence has absolutely no collateral of his own, he had to steal yours. I pointed a finger at his chest. I told my father that Terrence used that power of attorney to forge a property deed. He used my father's signature to list Reverend Thomas and Brenda as the primary borrowers on a $1.5 million debt. I watched the realization slowly wash over my mother's face. Brenda let out a loud, sobbing wail and buried her face in her hands. She finally understood that her precious son-in-law had just financially ruined them. But my father reacted entirely differently. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for his pride to handle. He could not accept the fact that he, the great Reverend Thomas, had been played for an absolute fool. He could not admit that the golden child's husband was a predatory scam artist. To admit that would mean admitting that he had been completely wrong about Terrence. It would mean admitting that he had been completely wrong about me. And his fragile narcissistic ego would rather burn the entire world down than admit he made a mistake. Instead of getting angry at Terrence, my father turned his intense wrath entirely onto me. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged as he pointed a shaking finger an inch from my face. He accused me of lying. He screamed that I was making up these elaborate financial terms just to ruin Desiree's special day. He told me I had always been insanely jealous of my sister and her perfect marriage. He said I spent my entire life sitting on the sidelines watching Desiree succeed, and now I was desperately trying to tear down her husband out of pure spite. He yelled that I was a bitter, lonely woman who could not stand to see a black man building true generational wealth. He completely ignored everything I had just told him about the appraiser and the fraudulent loan documents. He chose to live in a comfortable lie rather than face a devastating truth. I stood perfectly still and let him scream. I let him hurl every single insult he had been holding on to for decades. He called me selfish. He called me vindictive. He said I was a terrible daughter who lacked the basic Christian values of grace and forgiveness. He demanded that I apologize for slandering Terrence's good name. He ordered me to march out into that living room and play the role of the supportive sister, or else he would personally disown me in front of the entire congregation. He told me that if I did not fall in line and support Terrence's business venture, I would no longer be welcome in their family. He thought his threats would break me. He thought the fear of losing his parental approval would force me back into submission just like it always did when I was a child. He had absolutely no idea that his screaming was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. Every cruel word that left his mouth severed another emotional chain that had kept me tied to this toxic family. He made his choice perfectly clear. Even when presented with the absolute proof of his own financial destruction, he chose the scammer over his own daughter. He chose the illusion of perfection over the reality of my loyalty. He wanted to protect Terrence. He wanted to protect Desiree. He wanted to protect his own flawless image at all costs. I looked at the man who was supposed to be my protector, and I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no anger, just pure cold clarity. I took a step back and smoothed the fabric of my skirt. I looked at my father and gave him a slow, chilling smile. I told him he was absolutely right. I told him I would go out into that living room right now and give Terrence exactly the kind of support he truly deserved. My father did not understand the heavy sarcasm in my voice. He did not recognize the danger in my cold smile. Instead, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure indignance. He took my statement as a challenge rather than a surrender. He took a heavy step toward me, closing the distance between us until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He erupted all over again. He slammed his hand against the leather back of the sofa, where my mother was quietly weeping. He told me I was not going to walk out there and ruin his son-in-law's seminar with my secular corporate arrogance. He said he knew exactly what I was trying to do. He accused me of fabricating this entire story about forged documents and hard money loans simply because I had always been bitterly jealous of Desiree's flawless marriage. He pointed his finger directly at my face and told me that my jealousy was a sickness that was rotting my soul. He said I could never stand the fact that Desiree found a good God-fearing man while I was still single and living alone in a high-rise apartment. He yelled that my money meant absolutely nothing if I did not have a husband to share it with. He told me I was trying to tear down Terrence's reputation out of pure spite because I wanted Desiree to be as miserable and lonely as I was. It was the ultimate gaslighting technique. He was taking the very real financial crime Terrence had just committed against him and completely erasing it. He replaced it with a fictional narrative where I was the villain and Terrence was the innocent victim of my bitter spinsterhood. My father began to pace the room again, waving his arms frantically as he launched into his favorite sermon. He told me that Terrence was doing something profoundly important for the Black community. He said Terrence was out there in the trenches actively building true generational wealth. He claimed Terrence was establishing an empire that would provide for Desiree's children and their children's children. He looked at me with absolute disgust and said that all I cared about was my secular corporate money. He said my wealth was selfish because I only used it to buy myself fancy things and invest in soulless private equity funds. He completely ignored the fact that the very house he was standing in was paid for by my so-called selfish secular money. He had managed to convince himself that Terrence stealing my property was actually a noble crusade for the family legacy. The hypocrisy was so suffocating I could barely breathe. I stood my ground and stared at him as he continued to rewrite our entire family history. He yelled that I had always been ungrateful for everything they had done for me. I almost laughed out loud. I asked him what exactly he thought he had done for me. I reminded him that I had paid my own way through college. I worked 3 jobs while maintaining a full course load to pay for my computer science degree. I reminded him that while I was eating instant noodles and sleeping in the library, he and my mother had taken out a second mortgage on their house to pay for Desiree's massive, lavish wedding. They went $50,000 into debt just so Desiree could have a horse-drawn carriage and a 6-tier cake. My father did not even flinch. He told me that paying for Desiree's wedding was their duty as parents because she was honoring the family by marrying a doctor of business. That was the ridiculous title Terrence had given himself to sound more important. My father said I should have been happy to pay for my own education because it taught me independence. He twisted their blatant favoritism into a virtue. He said they always knew I was the strong one who could handle the struggle, but Desiree was delicate and needed to be protected. He told me that by hoarding my wealth now I was betraying the very independence they had so graciously taught me. The mental gymnastics required to justify their terrible parenting were absolutely astounding. He was effectively saying that because they abandoned me to fend for myself, I now owed them the fruits of my survival. My mother finally stopped crying long enough to chime in. She wiped her eyes with a tissue and looked up at me with a pathetic, pleading expression. She told me to listen to my father. She said that family is about sacrifice, and sometimes the strong have to carry the weak. She actually admitted that Terrence was weak. She admitted that Terrence needed my financial backing to succeed, but she framed it as my moral obligation rather than his massive failure. She begged me to just let Terrence have the loan. She said we could all sit down like a loving family next week and figure out a payment plan. She promised me that Terrence would pay me back every single penny once his real estate fund took off. She was completely delusional. She was asking me to willingly participate in a $1.5 million bank fraud to save her favorite daughter's husband from facing reality. My father saw my mother pleading and decided to use his ultimate weapon. He brought God into the argument. He lowered his voice to a dangerous theatrical register. He told me that the Lord commands us to honor our mother and father. He said that by disrespecting his wishes and threatening to expose Terrence, I was committing a grave sin against the family unit. He warned me that pride comes before the fall. He said my corporate success had made me arrogant and blind to the spiritual importance of family unity. He told me that if I walked out into that living room and caused a scene, God would strip away every single ounce of wealth I had accumulated. He was actively using his authority as a pastor to spiritually blackmail me into letting a scam artist steal my property. Any normal daughter would have broken down in tears at this point. Any normal person would have been crushed by the weight of their own parents aggressively teaming up to destroy their life. But I had spent 35 years building an emotional armor that was entirely impenetrable. I did not feel hurt. I did not feel betrayed. I only felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. Everything I had ever suspected about my parents was being confirmed right before my eyes. They did not love me. They loved the utility I provided. They loved the fact that I could be used as a financial human shield to protect Desiree from the consequences of her terrible choices. I realized in that moment that I owed them absolutely nothing. The debt of being their daughter was officially paid in full. I let my father finish his religious tirade. I let the silence hang in the room for a few seconds so the weight of his ridiculous words could fully settle. Then I took a step forward and invaded his personal space. I looked up into his angry eyes and spoke with absolute icy precision. I told him that religion has absolutely nothing to do with bank fraud. I told him that his precious son-in-law was a common criminal who was about to drag this entire family into a federal indictment. I told him that when the authorities come knocking on his door to ask why his signature is on a forged title deed, he can try preaching to them about generational wealth. I told him that I was not going to sacrifice my freedom or my company to save a man who leases his suits and lies about his income. For the first time during the entire argument, a flicker of genuine doubt crossed my father's face. The mention of federal indictments pierced through his thick layer of narcissistic delusion. He swallowed hard. The vein in his neck stopped pulsing quite so aggressively. He opened his mouth to argue back, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He looked at my mother, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the sofa. He realized that I was not backing down. He realized that the obedient, quiet little girl he used to bully was completely gone. I was a corporate executive who dealt with hostile takeovers and ruthless business negotiations for a living. His pastoral guilt trips were completely useless against me. He had lost control and he knew it. The tension in the dimly lit study was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My father was breathing heavily, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and newfound fear. My mother was silently weeping into her hands, fully realizing the catastrophic mess they had willingly walked into. I stood my ground, refusing to break eye contact with the man who had just tried to sacrifice me on the altar of his own ego. The battle lines were firmly drawn. There was no more room for negotiation. There was no more room for compromise. I was ready to walk out those doors and burn Terrence's empire to the ground. I turned around to grab the brass handle of the heavy oak door. But before my fingers could even touch the metal, the handle suddenly turned from the outside. The heavy oak doors swung open with a loud creak that shattered the heavy silence of the study. The bright light from the hallway spilled into the dark room, momentarily blinding us. I stepped back as a tall figure walked confidently into the room. It was Terrence. He was wearing a custom-tailored three-piece suit that I knew he had bought on credit. His expensive watch caught the light as he adjusted his cuffs. He did not look like a man who had just committed massive financial fraud. He did not look guilty or scared or worried about the appraiser outside. Instead, he looked directly at me. He tilted his head back and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was a cold, calculating, smug, predatory smile, the smile of a man who firmly believed he had already won. Terrence closed the heavy oak doors behind him with a soft click. He did not look like a man who had just been caught committing a massive financial crime. He looked entirely relaxed. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt and let his eyes wander around the dimly lit study. He saw my father standing frozen near the desk with his face flushed red. He saw my mother trembling on the leather sofa with tears streaming down her face. And then he looked at me. He let out a low, patronizing chuckle. He walked right past me and poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon from my father's crystal decanter. He took a slow sip and let out a satisfied sigh. He told me I was making a massive mistake by coming here today. He said Desiree warned him that I would show up and try to ruin their big moment just out of pure spite. He acted as if my presence was nothing more than a minor annoyance at a party he was graciously hosting. I watched him swallow the bourbon and I felt my jaw clench. I asked him if he had fun taking pictures with the bank appraiser outside. I asked him if he really thought he could steal a $3 million house without anyone noticing. I expected him to panic. I expected his smug smile to falter. But Terrence did not flinch. Instead, his smile grew even wider. He set his crystal glass down on the mahogany desk and turned to face me completely. He reached inside the breast pocket of his custom suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded document. He held it up in the dim light of the study so I could clearly see the official blue seal of the county clerk's office stamped on the front page. He flicked the thick paper with his index finger and let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He looked me dead in the eye and told me I was incredibly stupid. He took a step closer to me and shook the document in my face. He told me that for a woman who claimed to be a brilliant corporate executive, I had made the most amateur mistake in the entire world. He said I was an absolute fool for buying a $3 million piece of real estate and putting the title directly into my parents' personal names. He assumed that because I built this house as an anniversary gift, I had legally gifted them the deed free and clear. He laughed again, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the custom bookshelves. He told me he could not believe how easy it was to take everything I had worked for. He said all it took was one simple conversation with my naive father and a generic power of attorney form printed right off the internet. Terrence unfolded this document and proudly displayed the signature page. He pointed to the heavy black ink where my father had signed his name. He explained his master plan with the absolute pride of a supervillain explaining his evil plot. He told me that the moment my father signed that power of attorney, Terrence gained total legal control over my parents' estate. He said he immediately marched down to the county office and legally transferred the property deed of this lakefront mansion into the name of his own limited liability company. He tapped the top of the page where the name Terrence's Real Estate Wealth Holdings was printed in bold black letters. He looked at me with an expression of pure victory. He told me that this house no longer belonged to my parents. He said it definitely no longer belonged to me. He claimed that under the eyes of the law, he was the sole legal owner of the entire estate. I stared at the forged document in his hands. The sheer audacity of his confession was staggering. He was openly admitting to defrauding my parents and stealing my property, and he was doing it right in front of them. I looked over at my father, expecting him to finally explode with rage. I expected the great Reverend Thomas to grab Terrence by the collar and throw him out of the house. But my father did nothing. He just stood there, staring at the floor, completely broken by the realization that his idol was a common thief. Terrence noticed my father looking away and he smirked. He told me that my parents were fully on board with his vision. He claimed they understood that sacrifices had to be made to build a real family empire. He was completely delusional. I kept my voice perfectly flat and calm. I told Terrence that what he was holding in his hand was a forged document. I told him that transferring a deed using a power of attorney obtained through deception is a massive federal crime. I warned him that wire fraud and title forgery carry mandatory prison sentences. But Terrence simply rolled his eyes. He folded the fake deed and casually slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He stepped into my personal space until he was standing only inches away from me. He looked down at me, and his entire demeanor shifted from smug arrogance to absolute malice. The charming businessman act vanished entirely. He dropped his voice to a cold, threatening whisper. He told me I needed to listen to him very carefully. He said I was going to turn around, walk out the front door, get in my car, and drive back to my lonely little apartment in Chicago. He warned me that if I took one single step into that living room and tried to disrupt his investor seminar, he would destroy my life. He said if I opened my mouth and said a single word to his wealthy guests, he would immediately pull out his phone and call the local police. He told me he would show the arriving officers his legally stamped property deed. He said he would tell the police that a disgruntled, mentally unstable, estranged family member had broken into his corporate headquarters and was trespassing on his private property. He smiled maliciously and told me the police would not hesitate to put me in handcuffs and drag me out of here in front of everyone. I let out a short, bitter laugh. I asked him if he really thought the police would believe a man who leases his luxury cars over a woman who holds the actual construction receipts for the property. Terrence did not miss a beat. He leaned in even closer and delivered his ultimate patriarchal threat. He told me the police, the community, and the church would absolutely believe him over me. He puffed out his chest and reminded me that he was a charismatic, successful black man who provided for his beautiful wife. He said he was a respected pillar of the church community who played golf with the mayor and hosted charity dinners. He compared his fabricated social standing to my reality. He told me that to the outside world, I was just a bitter, childless single woman who was estranged from her own parents. He said society always labels women like me as angry and jealous. Terrence smiled, showing all of his perfectly whitened teeth. He told me my father would back up his story. He pointed at my silent father and said the Reverend himself would tell the police that I was trespassing. Terrence said my own parents would testify that I was having a mental breakdown because I was insanely jealous of Desiree's perfect life. He said nobody would ever believe my crazy story about fake deeds and shadow loans when the beloved Reverend Thomas and his successful son-in-law were standing united against me. He had weaponized my own family against me. He had weaponized the deeply ingrained misogyny of our social circle to guarantee his own protection. He fully believed his charisma and his gender gave him an absolute shield of invincibility. He stepped back and adjusted his tie. He told me the clock was ticking. He said his investors were waiting for his keynote speech and he was done wasting time arguing with a woman who did not know her place. He pointed toward the French doors leading to the backyard and ordered me to leave through the rear exit so the guests would not see my face. He warned me that this was my final warning. If I crossed the threshold into the main house, he would make sure I spent the night in a cold jail cell, and my professional reputation in the corporate world would be completely ruined. He turned his back on me to pour himself another glass of bourbon, acting as if the conversation was officially over, and he had emerged completely victorious. I stood frozen in the center of the room. I was not frozen out of fear. I was frozen because my mind was rapidly calculating the sheer beauty of the trap he had just walked himself into. He had absolutely no idea that his fake deed was entirely worthless. He had no idea that I held the property under a corporate shield. He thought he had me completely cornered. I took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the verbal blow that would shatter his fragile ego into a million pieces. I opened my mouth to tell him exactly who he was dealing with. I was ready to end his charade right then and there. But before a single syllable could leave my lips, a loud, agonizing wail erupted from the corner of the room. It was a sound of such pure, desperate panic that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I snapped my head toward the leather sofa. My mother Brenda had been sitting there in paralyzed silence for the entire confrontation. But Terrence's threat of calling the police and sending me to jail had finally shattered her shock. She let out another loud, sobbing cry. She scrambled off the edge of the leather cushions. Her expensive pearl necklace caught on the armrest and snapped, sending dozens of tiny white pearls scattering across the hardwood floor, but she did not even notice. She lunged forward across the expensive Persian rug. She did not run to Terrence to stop him from threatening her daughter. She did not run to my father to demand that he intervene and protect me. Instead, she threw her entire body downward. She dropped heavily onto her knees right in front of me. The loud thud of her knees hitting the floorboards echoed in the silent room. She reached out with trembling hands and wrapped her arms tightly around my legs. She buried her tear-stained face into the fabric of my skirt, weeping uncontrollably. I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me. The woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally was kneeling on the floor at my feet, not to comfort me but to beg me to surrender. I stared down at the top of my mother's head. Her shoulders heaved with violent sobs as her tears soaked directly into the fabric of my skirt. I felt completely paralyzed. For 35 years, I had desperately craved my mother's physical affection. I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn her warm embrace. But now that she was finally holding on to me, it felt like I was being suffocated by a venomous snake. I tried to pull my legs away from her grasp, but she tightened her grip with a surprising amount of desperate strength. She looked up at me with dark mascara running down her cheeks and her eyes wide with absolute blind panic. Her voice was barely a raspy whisper as she begged me not to destroy Terrence. She told me I had to let him keep the house. She said I had to let him finalize the bank loan today because if I did not, it would literally kill my sister. I demanded to know what on earth she was talking about. I asked her why a fraudulent commercial loan had absolutely anything to do with Desiree's physical health. My mother let out another agonizing wail and looked back at my father for permission to speak. My father simply looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother turned back to me and dropped the ultimate emotional bomb. She told me Desiree was pregnant. She claimed that Desiree had just found out 2 weeks ago after trying to conceive for nearly 3 years. My mother gripped my legs even tighter, digging her manicured fingernails into my skin. She said that Desiree was in a highly delicate condition and that her private doctor had explicitly warned the family that any severe emotional stress could easily cause a devastating miscarriage. She said Terrence was only trying to secure this massive loan to build a stable financial foundation for his unborn child. I looked over at Terrence to see if he was going to verify this sudden miraculous pregnancy. He was leaning casually against the edge of the mahogany desk, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He gave me a slow, pathetic nod. He put on a fake expression of deep paternal concern. He told me that everything he did was for his growing family. He claimed he took desperate measures because the pressure of providing for a new baby as a black man in America was simply too much to bear. He was actually using the hypothetical existence of a fetus to justify committing multiple federal felonies. He was using a baby to excuse the fact that he was currently trying to steal my $3 million property and bankrupt my parents. My mother began to speak rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to brainwash me. She told me that I had a moral obligation to protect the unborn child. She said that because I was single and focused solely on my corporate career, I could not possibly understand the sacred bond of motherhood. She said my money was just numbers on a computer screen, but Desiree's baby was a living, breathing continuation of our family bloodline. She actually looked me right in the eyes and asked me if I wanted to be the reason my sister loses everything. She asked me if I wanted the blood of my unborn niece or nephew on my hands. She told me that if I walked out into that living room and exposed Terrence, the shock would send Desiree straight to the hospital and it would be entirely my fault forever. The sheer toxicity of her words made the room spin. She was actively holding me hostage with guilt. But she did not stop there. She knew that family guilt might not be enough to break me, so she immediately pivoted to using the heavy pressure of our community. She brought up the church. She told me that my father had spent 30 years building his pristine reputation as the senior pastor of our community. She said the congregation looked up to our family as the ultimate example of Black excellence and spiritual purity. She warned me that if I sent my brother-in-law to federal prison, the scandal would completely destroy my father's legacy and tarnish the family name for generations to come. She told me the church elders would force my father to resign in absolute disgrace. She painted a horrifying picture of our family being completely ostracized from the only community they had ever known. She pointed a trembling finger at me and said the church will never forgive you if you send your brother-in-law to jail. She said everyone will view you as the evil, vindictive sister who destroyed her own family over a piece of real estate. She genuinely believed my silence could be bought with the threat of public embarrassment. I stood there listening to her weaponize religion, society, and biology all at the exact same time. She was trying to bury me under a mountain of shame so heavy that I would simply surrender my assets to make the screaming stop. I slowly looked around the dimly lit study, taking in the entire pathetic scene. I looked at my father, the great Reverend Thomas, the man who preached loudly about truth, justice, and standing up to evil every single Sunday. He was currently cowering in the shadows, entirely too proud to admit he had been conned by a smooth-talking fraud. He stood there frozen like a complete coward, refusing to protect the only daughter who had ever loved him. He was completely willing to let his own wife beg on the floor and let his own daughter be robbed blind, just so he would not have to admit he made a stupid mistake signing that power of attorney. Then I looked at Terrence. He was no longer hiding his amusement. He was watching my mother beg at my feet like it was the greatest theatrical performance he had ever seen. He let out a soft, arrogant chuckle that echoed off the high walls of the study. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned forward, resting his hands on the smooth surface of the mahogany desk. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He actually told me to be a good little sister and follow my mother's wise advice. He said there was no shame in admitting defeat when you are outsmarted by a superior opponent. He believed cultural pressure would force me into permanent silence. He thought I was just like my parents. He thought I was terrified of what the neighbors might think. He thought I valued the fake public image of our family more than I valued my own dignity and my own financial independence. He thought he had completely won. And finally, I looked back down at my mother, the woman who had just admitted she was perfectly fine with me losing $3 million as long as Desiree got to keep living in a fairy tale. I realized in that profound moment that there was absolutely nothing left to save here. This was not a family. They were broken, toxic people who would gladly drain every single drop of my blood if it meant keeping Terrence in custom-tailored suits. If I gave them this house today, the extortion would never end. I felt the last remaining thread of emotional attachment to these people completely snap. It felt like a massive, suffocating weight had just been lifted off my chest. I did not feel the need to argue with any of them anymore. I did not need to defend my character against my mother's ridiculous accusations about jealousy and bitterness. Let them think I was the villain. Let them think I was a terrible, heartless corporate monster. I was going to show them exactly what a corporate monster looks like when you try to steal her empire. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed my mother's wrists. I peeled her trembling hands off my legs one by one. She looked up at me with hopeful, desperate eyes, thinking that my silence meant I had finally broken. She genuinely thought I was going to help her up and tell her that everything was going to be perfectly okay. Instead, I dropped her hands and took a large step back, smoothing the wrinkles out of my skirt. I stood perfectly straight and looked directly at Terrence. He put his crystal glass down and crossed his arms, waiting for me to surrender completely. I let a slow, freezing cold smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that made Terrence's smug expression falter for just a fraction of a second. I looked at the three of them, the cowardly father, the manipulative mother, and the arrogant thief. I stopped fighting. I simply nodded my head and said, "Okay, let us go out there." Terrence pushed the heavy oak doors open and gestured for me to step out into the hallway first. He did it with an exaggerated sweeping motion of his arm, like a king graciously allowing a peasant to walk ahead of him. I stepped out of the suffocating study, and he followed closely behind me. As we walked down the long corridor toward the main living room, he was practically bouncing on his heels. He was vibrating with the ecstatic energy of a man who firmly believed he had just conquered his greatest enemy. He hummed a soft, cheerful tune under his breath while straightening his silk tie and adjusting his expensive cufflinks. He actually reached out and patted me on the shoulder. He told me I was making the smartest decision of my entire life. He said he knew I would eventually come to my senses and recognize his absolute authority. He told me that successful families only survive when everyone understands the hierarchy. I did not shrug his hand off. I did not flinch. I just kept walking forward with my head held high, letting him bask in his imaginary victory. Every step we took away from that dark study and toward the bright lights of the main foyer felt like a countdown. The main hall was even more crowded than when I first arrived. The catering staff had brought out massive silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The room was buzzing with the loud, confident chatter of wealthy real estate investors. These were people with serious money looking for the next big opportunity. Terrence had somehow managed to gather a room full of legitimate heavy hitters from Atlanta and Chicago. I recognized a few faces from my own corporate dealings at the private equity firm. There were managing directors from regional banks and wealthy private angel investors looking to diversify their portfolios. It made his impending downfall even more delicious. He had brought the exact people who could permanently blacklist him from the financial world. As we stepped into the grand foyer, Desiree immediately spotted us. She had been nervously glancing toward the hallway the entire time we were in the study. When she saw Terrence smiling and saw me walking quietly beside him, her entire posture changed. The tense, rigid fear vanished from her shoulders. It was instantly replaced by her trademark arrogance. She excused herself from a group of older businessmen and practically glided over to us. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. She handed her empty champagne flute to a passing waiter without even looking at him. She stepped right up to me and grabbed my arm just like she had done at the front door. But this time her grip was not desperate, it was entirely condescending. She leaned in close so only I could hear her over the jazz music. Her expensive perfume was overwhelming and sickeningly sweet. She whispered that she was incredibly glad I finally decided to learn my place. She told me she was terrified I was going to throw a jealous temper tantrum and embarrass the family in front of high society. She squeezed my arm tightly and told me to just stand in the corner, smile, and let the real adults handle the business. She said if I behave myself today, she might let me come over for the holidays to see the new baby. She told me that Terrence was doing this for all of us, and I needed to stop being so utterly selfish. I looked at my sister, the golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She was so completely wrapped up in her own delusions of grandeur that she could not see the massive tidal wave coming right at her. I gave her a polite, empty smile. I told her I would not dream of ruining her husband's big moment. I told her I was looking forward to hearing exactly what Terrence had to say. Desiree smirked, thinking I had been completely broken and tamed by our parents. She patted my cheek like I was an obedient dog and stepped back to join the front row of the audience. She crossed her arms and looked at Terrence with absolute adoration. Terrence walked over to the center of the grand staircase. He picked up a wireless microphone from a small audio table the event planners had set up. He tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp thud echoed through the massive built-in speakers I had personally wired into the ceiling. The smooth jazz music slowly faded out. The loud chatter of the wealthy investors quickly quieted down. Every single face in the room turned toward the grand staircase. Terrence stood on the second step, elevating himself above the crowd. He spread his arms wide and flashed a brilliant, blinding smile. He welcomed everyone to his inaugural wealth-building summit. His voice was smooth, confident, and dripping with charismatic charm. He launched into a grand, sweeping speech about the importance of Black excellence and generational wealth. He used all the right buzzwords. He talked about breaking the cycle of poverty, about seizing opportunities in the commercial real estate market, and about building an empire that could be passed down to our children. It was a perfectly rehearsed performance. He sounded exactly like my father delivering a Sunday sermon to a packed church. He had the crowd completely captivated. Several older investors were nodding along in agreement, holding their champagne glasses and hanging on to his every word. He painted himself as a visionary pioneer who was selflessly paving the way for his community. He spoke about the struggles of breaking into high-level commercial real estate and how his new fund was going to disrupt the entire industry. And then he did the one thing that guaranteed his total destruction. He looked directly at me, standing quietly near the edge of the staircase. He extended his hand toward me and gestured for me to join him. He spoke directly into the microphone and told the crowd that family was the absolute foundation of his success. He called me his brilliant sister-in-law. He said I was a successful corporate woman working in Chicago who had traveled all the way here just to support his vision. The crowd clapped politely. Terrence stepped down, grabbed my hand, and physically pulled me up onto the second step right next to him. He wrapped his heavy arm tightly around my shoulders. He pulled me close, pressing me against his side to project the image of a perfectly united, loving family. My skin absolutely crawled at his touch. I could smell the expensive cologne he had bought with stolen money, but I forced my face to remain perfectly neutral. I let him hold me hostage in front of the entire room. Terrence raised the microphone back to his mouth. He told the investors that a true visionary does not just talk about wealth. A true visionary takes bold, aggressive action. He swept his free arm across the room, gesturing to the vaulted ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, and the imported marble floors. He announced to the silent room that the magnificent $3 million estate they were currently standing in was not just a rented venue. He declared that it was the first major multi-million-dollar acquisition of his new investment fund. The crowd let out a collective murmur of genuine impressed approval. Acquiring a property of this magnitude proved that he was a serious player in the high-stakes real estate game. It gave him instant credibility with the wealthy investors he was trying to scam. Terrence basked in their admiration for a few seconds before continuing his absolute lie. He told them he had just finalized the deed transfer this very morning. He named the exact price. He named the exact square footage. He had memorized all the details from the fake appraisal documents. He told the crowd that negotiating this deal was the hardest fight of his professional career. He claimed he had to ruthlessly outmaneuver a massive, faceless corporate entity to secure this crown jewel for his portfolio. He leaned into the microphone and boldly stated the name of the company he allegedly defeated. He said he bought the property in a pure cash deal from a private equity firm called Vanguard Holdings. He paused for dramatic effect. He waited for the applause to wash over him. The investors clapped enthusiastically. Desiree was standing in the front row, beaming with absolute pride. My father and mother had finally crept out of the dark study and were standing at the back of the room watching Terrence with tears of joy in their eyes. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought Terrence had successfully pulled off the greatest scam in family history. Terrence squeezed my shoulder even tighter. He looked down at me with his smug, predatory smile. He wanted to twist the knife one last time. He wanted to force me to publicly bow down to him in front of his wealthy peers. He wanted me to verbally confirm his lie and validate his fake empire. He held the microphone out toward my face. He spoke to the crowd, but his eyes were locked on mine. He said his sister-in-law works in the high-stakes corporate finance world, and she knows a brilliant acquisition when she sees one. He asked me to say a few words to the investors about the value of this magnificent property and the incredible future of his firm. I looked at the microphone hovering just inches from my mouth. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces. I saw Desiree giving me a warning glare, telling me not to mess this up. I saw my parents holding their breath at the back of the room, hoping I would play my assigned role. I saw Terrence standing beside me, practically glowing with absolute arrogance. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed. He had given me a live microphone in front of a room full of heavy investors. I reached out and wrapped my fingers firmly around the cool metal of the microphone. I gently stepped out from under his heavy arm. The entire room went completely silent, waiting for me to speak. I looked Terrence right in the eye and offered him one final chilling smile. The trap was officially sprung. I held the microphone loosely in my right hand, feeling the smooth, cold metal against my palm. The entire room was completely silent. Dozens of wealthy investors wearing expensive suits and holding crystal champagne flutes were staring up at me, waiting for me to validate the man standing beside me. I could feel Terrence's heavy hand resting confidently on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a physical reminder of the threat he had delivered just minutes ago in the dark study. He fully expected me to fall in line. He expected me to play the role of the dutiful, supportive sister-in-law. I looked out into the crowd and found my sister Desiree standing in the front row. She was beaming with absolute pride, her arms crossed and her chin held high, completely oblivious to the fact that her perfect world was about to end. I took a slow, deep breath and raised the microphone to my lips. I started speaking in a calm, measured tone. I projected my voice clearly, letting it echo across the vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. I told the crowd that it was an absolute honor to stand in such a magnificent piece of real estate. I praised the imported marble floors. I complimented the intricate crown molding. I spoke about the solid reinforced foundation and the custom slate roof. I described the house with the precise technical language of a seasoned corporate real estate executive. The investors nodded in agreement, appreciating my professional assessment of the property. Terrence smiled even wider, thinking I was playing perfectly into his carefully constructed narrative. He squeezed my shoulder affectionately as if to reward me for being a good, obedient girl. I turned my head slightly and looked directly at Terrence. I asked him a simple question so everyone in the room could hear. I asked him to clarify the name of the massive corporate entity he had so brilliantly outmaneuvered to secure this property. Terrence puffed out his chest and leaned into the microphone I was holding. He spoke with absolute arrogance. He proudly declared to the entire room that he had successfully negotiated the purchase from Vanguard Holdings. He bragged that Vanguard was a ruthless private equity firm, but he had managed to beat them at their own game, securing this $3 million estate in a pure cash deal. He looked out at the crowd, expecting another round of applause for his supposed business genius. But I did not let the crowd applaud. I pulled the microphone away from his mouth and took a step sideways, forcing his heavy arm to drop off my shoulder. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. The event planners had set up a massive 90-inch smart television on the wall, right behind the grand staircase, displaying a looping slideshow of Terrence's fake corporate logos. I tapped my screen a few times, syncing my phone directly to the television via the wireless casting network. The fake corporate logos instantly vanished from the screen. They were immediately replaced by a crisp, high-resolution scan of a legal document bearing the official seal of the Illinois Secretary of State. I raised the microphone back to my lips and directed the crowd's attention to the massive screen behind us. I told them they were looking at the official state registry documents for Vanguard Holdings Limited Liability Company. I read the text aloud, ensuring every single word carried the weight of absolute legal certainty. I pointed out the date of incorporation. I highlighted the registered business address in downtown Chicago. And then I read the most important line of all. I announced that Vanguard Holdings was not a massive faceless corporate entity. It was a private holding company. And the sole proprietor, the chief executive officer, and the 100% legal owner of Vanguard Holdings was me. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and suffocating. It was not the polite quiet of an attentive audience. It was the stunned, paralyzing silence of a room full of intelligent people, simultaneously realizing they were witnessing a massive financial train wreck. The investors stopped drinking their champagne. They stared at the screen, and then they stared at Terrence. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Terrence had just bragged about buying a house from a company owned entirely by the woman standing right next to him. A woman who was actively displaying the legal proof that she still owned it. I turned my body to fully face Terrence. His smug, confident smile had completely vanished. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His eyes darted frantically between my face and the massive legal document glowing on the screen behind him. He was completely trapped. The lie he had built his entire fake empire upon was crumbling to dust in front of the very people he was trying to scam. He realized in that agonizing moment that he had never possessed the upper hand. I had let him walk himself right to the edge of the cliff before I pushed him over. Down in the front row, the illusion finally shattered for Desiree. Her perfect posture collapsed. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the imported marble floor, sending shards of glass and expensive alcohol flying across the expensive shoes of the investors standing next to her. But nobody even looked down at the mess. Desiree's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure panic and rage. She pointed a trembling finger at the television screen and screamed at the top of her lungs. She yelled that the document was a fake. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous liar who was trying to sabotage her husband's legitimate business. She looked wildly at the investors around her, begging them not to believe me. She yelled that I had hacked the television and that I was having a mental breakdown. Her screaming only made the situation worse for Terrence. The investors were not fools. They were seasoned businessmen who knew exactly what a legitimate state registry document looked like. They could see the official watermarks and the notarized signatures projected clearly in high definition. They began to murmur among themselves. The murmurs quickly grew into loud, angry whispers. I could hear the words fraud and scam rippling through the crowd. Men in tailored suits began pulling out their phones, rapidly typing messages to their legal teams and their banks. The entire seminar was actively imploding in real time. My father and mother, who had been watching proudly from the back of the room, were now frozen in absolute terror. My father looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He finally understood the catastrophic reality of what he had done by signing that power of attorney. He had not helped build a family empire. He had actively participated in the attempted theft of his own daughter's company assets. My mother covered her face with her hands, unable to watch the public destruction of her favorite son-in-law. They had tried to protect his image at my expense, and now that very image was being broadcast as a criminal lie to the wealthiest people in the city. Terrence desperately tried to salvage the situation. He reached out to grab the microphone from my hand, his fingers trembling violently. He stammered, trying to force a laugh that sounded completely unhinged. He told the crowd that this was all just a massive misunderstanding. He claimed there was a minor clerical error with the title company and that the paperwork was simply delayed. He tried to project his fake confidence, but his voice cracked and the sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, begging me silently to stop the presentation and let him explain his way out of it. He actually thought he could still talk his way out of federal fraud. I did not let go of the microphone. I gripped it tighter and stepped closer to him, invading his personal space just like he had done to me in the study. I looked deep into his terrified eyes and let him see the absolute coldness of my resolve. I was not going to let him off the hook. I was going to finish the job he started. I spoke into the microphone, my voice cutting sharply through the rising chaos in the room. I told Terrence that forging a property deed to steal a house from my company was a brilliant move for a desperate man. I complimented his audacity, but then I told him that stealing the house was only half of his actual crime. I paused, letting the tension in the room build to an absolute breaking point. I looked out at the angry investors who were now actively demanding answers. Then I turned my attention back to the man sweating profusely beside me. I asked him a question that made his knees physically buckle. I asked him if he wanted to be the one to tell this room full of people exactly who he was borrowing the $1.5 million from. I asked him if he wanted to explain the specific details of the shadow loan he had desperately secured using my stolen property as collateral. The trap was fully sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. Terrence lunged forward. His perfectly manicured hands clawed desperately at the microphone in my grip. He was no longer trying to maintain his charming facade. Pure and absolute animalistic panic had completely taken over his brain. As his fingers wrapped around the metal mesh of the microphone, a loud, piercing feedback screech echoed through the vaulted ceilings, causing several investors in the front row to physically flinch and cover their ears. Terrence yanked the microphone toward his chest, panting heavily. He looked frantically toward the audio technician standing near the catering tables and aggressively dragged his finger across his throat, ordering the man to cut the sound system immediately. The audio technician just stood there, frozen in shock, staring at the massive legal document still projected brightly on the 90-inch television screen behind us. Terrence realized the sound was not going to be cut. He pressed the microphone to his mouth and tried to force another sickeningly sweet laugh. He told the crowd that his sister-in-law was clearly having a severe mental health crisis. He begged the investors to be patient while he handled this tragic family emergency. He said the stress of my corporate job had finally pushed me over the edge, and I was making up wild conspiracy theories. But his voice was shaking so violently that the microphone rattled against his teeth. The investors were not buying a single word of his pathetic excuses. They were staring at him with absolute contempt. I did not try to wrestle the microphone back from him. I simply took a step down the grand staircase, placing myself closer to the wealthy crowd. I raised my natural voice, letting it carry through the silent room with the practiced authority of a woman who runs boardrooms for a living. I told the investors they did not need to take my word for it. I pointed toward the heavy mahogany front doors at the far end of the foyer. I called out a name that made Terrence's blood freeze solid. I asked Mr. Sterling to please step forward. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the independent commercial property appraiser walked into the center of the room. He was still wearing his casual polo shirt, with his professional digital camera hanging around his neck and his digital tablet clutched tightly in his hands. He looked incredibly out of place among the tailored suits and designer dresses, but he carried an undeniable air of objective authority. He walked right up to the edge of the grand staircase and looked up at Terence with a deeply disappointed expression. I turned to the crowd and introduced him properly. I told the room full of elite real estate investors that this man was not a party guest or a caterer. I explained that Arthur Sterling was a senior commercial property appraiser sent over from Metro Financial Services. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. Every single person in that room understood exactly what an emergency weekend appraisal meant. It meant absolute desperation. I looked back at Terence, who was now visibly sweating. Large beads of perspiration were rolling down his forehead and soaking into the collar of his custom shirt. I told the crowd that Terence did not invite them here to celebrate a massive corporate acquisition. He invited them here to use their presence as a glamorous backdrop, while he secretly finalized the paperwork to borrow $1.5 million against a house he did not even own. I looked at Mr. Sterling and asked him to confirm the specific type of financial institution that had ordered his emergency rush appraisal on a Saturday afternoon. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked at his digital tablet. He spoke clearly so the entire room could hear him. He stated that the appraisal was ordered by a private shadow lender operating out of Chicago. The term shadow lender hung in the air like a heavy, toxic cloud. The wealthy investors immediately began whispering furiously to one another. I turned back to face Terence and projected my voice over the rising chaos. I told the crowd exactly why a self-proclaimed real estate mogul was dealing with shadow lenders instead of reputable banks. I explained that Terence had absolutely zero liquid capital and a credit score that was completely ruined by maxed-out credit cards and leased luxury cars. I told them that no traditional bank in the country would ever approve him for a legitimate commercial loan. He was entirely blacklisted from the standard financial system, so he had to go to a hard money lender. For those who do not work in high finance, a hard money loan is a desperate measure of last resort. It is a short-term loan secured entirely by real estate carrying exorbitant predatory interest rates. It is the kind of loan you only take when you are completely out of options and drowning in debt. I looked Terence up and down with absolute disgust. I told the crowd that Terence's master plan was to forge a deed, steal my $3 million property, and use it as collateral to secure a massive cash injection from a shadow bank. He was going to use that $1.5 million to pay off his mounting personal debts and fund his fake millionaire lifestyle for another few years. When the hard money lender inevitably foreclosed on the property due to missed payments, Terence would simply walk away, leaving my company to deal with the catastrophic legal fallout. He thought it was the perfect victimless crime because he assumed I was too stupid to ever find out. He assumed the out-of-state LLC on the property deed was just a generic holding company that would not notice the fraudulent transfer until it was far too late. I walked slowly across the bottom step of the staircase, closing the distance between myself and Terence. He was backing away from me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He bumped against the wooden banister, clutching the microphone like a lifeline. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the absolute crushing blow. I told him that out of all the predatory hard money lenders in the entire country, he made the spectacular mistake of going to a firm based in downtown Chicago. I asked him if he remembered the specific name of the private lending firm that approved his fraudulent application. Terence opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was hyperventilating. I answered the question for him. I said the firm is called Apex Capital Solutions. I watched his eyes widen even further as the realization finally clicked into place. I smiled coldly and told him that the managing director of Apex Capital Solutions is a man named David. I told Terence that David happens to be my senior business partner and my closest friend in the private equity world. I explained that David called me on my personal cell phone 3 days ago. He told me that a desperate guy from Connecticut had just submitted a highly suspicious rush application for a $1.5 million collateralized loan. David recognized the property address immediately because he personally helped me secure the commercial zoning permits when I built this lakefront mansion 2 years ago. And when David saw my father's forged signature on the fake title transfer, he immediately sent the entire fraudulent file directly to my secure corporate email. I let the reality of my words sink into Terrence's brain. I wanted him to fully understand how completely outmatched he was. I told him I knew about his pathetic little scam since Wednesday morning. I knew about the forged power of attorney. I knew about the fake LLC. I knew about his desperate need for cash. I could have stopped the title transfer immediately. I could have called my parents and warned them, but I did not. I told Terrence I let him proceed with his fraudulent application. I let him pay the exorbitant rush fees to send Mr. Sterling out here today. I let him rent the expensive catering equipment and hire the valet parkers. I let him invite the wealthiest investors in the city to this massive fake seminar. I let him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could, so that when I finally pushed him in, he would never be able to climb back out. The room absolutely exploded. The polite, wealthy investors completely dropped their professional composure. A tall man in a custom gray suit shoved his way to the front of the crowd, pointing a furious finger right at Terrence. He demanded his $50,000 deposit check back immediately. Another investor standing near the doorway started shouting that he was calling the state attorney general's office to report massive securities fraud. The quiet, elegant foyer turned into a chaotic shouting match as dozens of angry rich people realized they had almost handed their money over to a con artist. Desiree was sobbing hysterically at the bottom of the stairs, covering her face in absolute humiliation as her wealthy new friends actively turned against her husband. Terrence was completely frozen. He dropped the microphone. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack and rolled away. He was sweating profusely, his expensive suit clinging to his trembling body. He looked frantically toward the front door, desperately searching for an escape route, but the angry investors were completely blocking his path. He was trapped in a prison of his own making. Suddenly, a loud, booming voice cut through the chaos. My father, Reverend Thomas, shoved his way violently through the crowd of angry investors. His face was purple with pure, unadulterated rage. He marched right up to the bottom of the staircase and pointed a shaking finger at my face. He completely ignored Terrence's massive criminal fraud. He ignored the angry investors demanding their money back. His only concern was protecting his own fragile ego and his pristine public image. He used his deepest, most authoritative pastor voice to command me to stop speaking immediately. He yelled that I was destroying the family name. He screamed that I was a vindictive, horrible daughter for publicly humiliating Terrence in front of the entire community. He demanded that I turn off the television screen and tell the crowd I was making a terrible mistake. He actually ordered me to fix this mess and save his reputation before the church elders found out. I looked down at my father standing there demanding my obedience while the ashes of his golden child's fake empire rained down around him. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. He wanted to play the role of the righteous patriarch defending his family against a wicked daughter. He wanted to pretend he was an innocent victim of my corporate cruelty. I decided it was time to strip away his final illusion. I leaned forward and looked directly into my father's angry eyes. I told him he should probably stop worrying about his public reputation and start worrying about his upcoming homelessness. I dropped the final single most devastating financial bomb on my naive parents. I kept my eyes locked on my father as the echoes of his screaming faded into the tense air of the grand foyer. He was still pointing his finger at me, expecting me to crumble under the weight of his parental authority. He truly believed he was the righteous victim in this scenario. He had no idea that the document he signed in the dark study was a loaded gun pointed directly at his own head. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I spoke with a piercing clarity that demanded the attention of every single person in the room. I asked my father if he genuinely understood how the shadow banking system operates. I asked him if he thought a predatory lender from Chicago was going to hand over $1.5 million in pure cash based solely on a freshly printed property deed. My father blinked, his face still flushed purple with rage. He opened his mouth to deliver another self-righteous sermon, but I completely cut him off. I told him that hard money lenders do not care about charisma. They do not care about tailored suits or grand speeches about generational wealth. They only care about absolute financial security. I explained that when Terrence submitted his fraudulent loan application, my business partner David immediately ran a comprehensive background check on Terrence. The results were absolutely catastrophic. I told my father that Terrence has an abysmal credit score. He has outstanding civil judgments against him from unpaid contractors and 2 luxury vehicles on the verge of repossession. I watched my father's arrogant posture begin to waver as I laid out the undeniable facts of his son-in-law's pathetic reality. I raised my voice so the entire crowd of wealthy investors could hear the climax of this financial autopsy. I told my father that because Terrence's credit was completely toxic, the hard money lender demanded additional security. A forged deed to a lakefront mansion was simply not enough to satisfy the risk assessment team. They needed guaranteed liquid assets. They needed a secondary guarantor who had a pristine credit history and a lifetime of verifiable savings. I paused and looked directly at my mother. She was gripping his suit jacket, her knuckles completely white. I told them both that Terrence found his perfect secondary guarantor. He found someone naive enough to sign a blanket power of attorney without having a lawyer read a single page. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. The angry investors had stopped demanding their money back. They were completely captivated by the horrifying family drama unfolding in front of them. My father lowered his pointing finger. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He stammered, asking me what exactly I meant by a secondary guarantor. I took another step closer to him, invading his personal space, just as Terrence had done to me earlier. I explained the concept of cross-collateralization, keeping the financial terminology brutally simple so there was absolutely no room for misunderstanding. I told my father that Terrence used that signed power of attorney to legally pledge every single asset my parents owned as a secondary guarantee for the loan. My father shook his head vigorously in complete denial. He said Terrence would never do something like that. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the marble floors. I told my father he was a complete fool. I detailed exactly what was written in the loan documents that David had emailed to me. I told my father that Terrence secretly put a massive lien on the small colonial house my parents had lived in for 30 years. He pledged the equity of the home they had worked their entire lives to pay off. But Terrence did not stop there. I told my father that Terrence also pledged the entirety of his church pension fund. Terrence had legally bound their financial existence to his fraudulent real estate scheme. I watched the devastating reality finally crash down on my father. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal completely broke his mind. If the loan had gone through, Terrence would have received $1.5 million in cash to hide in offshore accounts or blow on his fake lifestyle. But when the loan inevitably defaulted, the shadow bank would not just seize the lakefront mansion. They would immediately execute the cross-collateralization clause. I spelled out the consequences with absolute ruthless precision. I told my father that the bank would foreclose on his family home and evict him and my mother onto the street. The bank would drain his pension account, leaving him with absolutely nothing. Terrence was perfectly willing to render my parents completely homeless and penniless just to save himself. My father stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of a catering table to stop himself from collapsing onto the marble floor. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He turned his head slowly and looked at Terrence. Terrence was standing frozen near the grand staircase, his expensive suit soaked in nervous sweat. Terrence tried to shake his head. He held his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He opened his mouth to formulate another lie to tell my father that it was only a temporary measure. But no words came out. His absolute guilt was written all over his terrified face. My mother let out a horrific, gut-wrenching scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that chilled my bones. She released her grip on my father's jacket and dropped to her knees right there in the middle of the crowded foyer. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, rocking back and forth as she wailed uncontrollably. She had spent my entire life protecting Terrence and making endless excuses for Desiree. She had willingly sacrificed my emotional well-being to maintain their facade. And now the golden child's husband had repaid her blind loyalty by secretly trying to steal her home and her retirement. The utter devastation of that realization was tearing her apart from the inside out. But the most violent reaction did not come from my parents. It came from the front row of the audience. Desiree had been standing there paralyzed, listening to me systematically dismantle her entire reality. She had spent the last 5 years acting superior to everyone else because she was married to a wealthy entrepreneur. She had looked down on me. She had genuinely believed she was living a fairy tale. But the truth was finally undeniable. Her husband was not a millionaire. He was a broke, desperate scam artist who had just attempted to permanently bankrupt her own parents to fund her designer wardrobe. The illusion of her perfect marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces. Desiree let out a feral, furious scream. She lunged forward, her designer heels clicking rapidly against the floor. She charged directly at Terrence. Before he could even raise his hands to defend himself, she swung her arm back and slapped him across the face with everything she had. The sharp crack of her hand hitting his cheek echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. Terrence's head snapped to the side. He stumbled backward, crashing into the wooden banister of the staircase. Desiree did not stop. She grabbed the lapels of his custom suit and began shaking him violently. She screamed in his face, demanding to know if it was true. She screamed at him for lying to her, for humiliating her in front of high society, and for trying to steal her parents' home. Terrence tried to push her away, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. He grabbed her wrists and yelled at her to calm down, begging her not to make a scene in front of the investors. But the investors were already backing away, looking at the fighting couple with absolute disgust. The room had descended into complete and utter chaos. My father was hyperventilating, leaning heavily against the catering table. My mother was sobbing hysterically on the marble floor. Desiree was thrashing and screaming, clawing at Terrence's expensive shirt, while he desperately tried to restrain her. I stood perfectly still in the absolute center of the beautiful house, watching the toxic fake empire they had built together burn completely and irrevocably to the ground, right before my own very eyes. I did not need to say another word. My part in this destruction was officially over. I took a step back, adjusting my blazer, preparing to leave them all to wallow in the miserable ruins of their own making. I turned my body toward the hallway, ready to walk away from my toxic family forever. But just as I took my first step toward freedom, the chaotic screaming in the foyer was suddenly interrupted. A loud, heavy, authoritative sound cut entirely through the noise of the fighting. It was a sharp, aggressive pounding coming directly from the massive mahogany front doors. It was not the polite, gentle knock of a late party guest. It was the heavy, relentless pounding of someone who demanded immediate legal entry. The entire room instantly froze in absolute silence. Desiree stopped screaming mid-sentence. Terrence released her wrists, his eyes wide with renewed terror as he looked toward the entrance. The heavy pounding echoed through the house again, followed by a deep, commanding voice shouting from the other side of the thick, solid wood. Federal Bureau of Investigation opened the door immediately. The voice was so loud and commanding that it literally rattled the imported custom glass of the front windows. Before anyone inside could even react, the heavy mahogany doors were aggressively pushed open by one of the terrified valet attendants outside. A team of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs marched into the grand foyer. They were flanked by 4 local uniformed police officers whose hands were resting cautiously on their duty belts. Their heavy black boots echoed sharply against the pristine marble floors, completely shattering the elegant atmosphere of the high society gathering. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked on the front lawn cast an eerie spinning glow through the open doorway, painting the shocked faces of the wealthy investors in alternating colors of panic and dread. The lead federal agent stepped forward. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face and absolutely zero tolerance for the extravagant wealth displayed in the room. He held up a silver badge and a thick folder of legal paperwork. He scanned the silent, terrified crowd of real estate moguls and demanded to know which one of them was Terrence. The reaction of the crowd was immediate and ruthless. These were seasoned financial investors. They knew exactly how dangerous it was to be anywhere near a federal raid. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever criminal enterprise had brought the FBI to this address. The crowd parted instantly, actively stepping away and leaving Terrence completely isolated in the center of the floor. Terrence was still pinned against the wooden banister of the grand staircase where Desiree had just slapped him. He looked incredibly small. The charismatic visionary entrepreneur who had been delivering a grand speech just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. He was replaced by a trembling, sweating, terrified little boy who realized his entire life was over. The lead agent locked his eyes on Terrence and began walking toward him. Before the agent could read him his rights, I took a calm, deliberate step forward and cleared my throat. I addressed the lead agent by his name. I said, "Good afternoon, Special Agent Miller. I am Nia. We spoke on the phone earlier today." The agent stopped and looked at me. His stern expression softened just a fraction, and he gave me a professional nod. He told me that his team had received the secure digital dossier I submitted to their financial crimes division. He thanked me for my extensive cooperation and confirmed that the evidence I provided was more than enough to secure an immediate emergency arrest warrant from the federal judge. Terrence snapped his head toward me. His eyes were wide with a mixture of utter confusion and profound horror. His jaw actually dropped open. He stammered, asking me what I had done. I looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. I told him he was incredibly arrogant to think I would let him orchestrate a $1.5 million bank fraud without taking precautions. I explained that I did not just come here today to embarrass him in front of his fake friends. I told him that the moment my business partner David sent me the forged title documents on Wednesday morning, I forwarded the entire file directly to the regional FBI field office in Chicago. I told Terrence that I spent the last 3 days working quietly with federal investigators to build an airtight criminal case against him. I let him throw this lavish party. I let him invite all these wealthy witnesses. I let him stand on that staircase and publicly confess to the fraudulent acquisition of Vanguard Holdings property into a live microphone. I told him I did all of that specifically to ensure the federal agents could catch him right in the middle of committing the crime. I did not just let him dig his own grave. I called the mortician to come and collect the body. Special Agent Miller stepped up to Terrence and grabbed his arm, spinning him around roughly against the wooden banister. The sound of cold steel handcuffs clicking loudly around Terrence's wrists echoed through the silent grand foyer. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Agent Miller began reciting the Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice. He informed Terrence that he was being placed under federal arrest for multiple felony charges. He listed them out one by one for the entire room to hear. Wire fraud, title forgery, identity theft, and attempted bank fraud. Every single charge carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. Terrence did not try to fight back. He did not scream or argue his innocence. He simply slumped forward, his expensive, custom-tailored suit wrinkling as the agents patted him down and confiscated his phone and his wallet. He was completely broken. The wealthy investors who had been ready to write him massive checks just moments ago were now pulling out their own phones, taking pictures and recording videos of his humiliating downfall. His reputation in the corporate world was permanently incinerated. Desiree had been standing frozen near the bottom step watching the federal agent slap handcuffs on her husband. The sheer reality of the situation finally penetrated her deep layer of delusion. She realized that her perfect fairy tale life was actively being dragged out the front door in steel chains. She realized that without Terrence's fake money, she would be completely exposed as a fraud to all of her rich sorority friends. She snapped out of her shock and launched into a state of pure frantic desperation. She ran toward the federal agent, screaming at the top of her lungs. She grabbed Agent Miller's windbreaker and tried to physically pull him away from Terrence. She cried hysterically, yelling that they were making a terrible mistake. She screamed that her husband was a brilliant entrepreneur and that this was all just a simple corporate misunderstanding. Agent Miller easily brushed her off, warning her firmly to step back, or she would be arrested for interfering with a federal investigation. Desiree stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the marble floor. She realized she could not control the police, so she turned her frantic energy entirely toward me. She ran over to where I was standing and actually grabbed the lapels of my blazer. Her perfect makeup was completely ruined by her tears. Dark mascara was running down her cheeks, making her look unhinged. She shook my blazer and begged me to stop this. She pleaded with me to tell the FBI that it was just a family dispute over property. She told me I had the power to make them go away. She sobbed violently, telling me that Terrence was my brother-in-law and that I was destroying our family. She actually brought up the baby again, crying that I was going to force her child to be born while its father was sitting in a federal penitentiary. I looked down at her hands gripping my clothes. The absolute audacity of her begging was genuinely astounding. After decades of treating me like garbage, after insulting me at the front door, after cheering for Terrence while he tried to steal my property and bankrupt our parents, she still believed she was entitled to my protection. She still believed that her tears could magically erase multiple federal felonies. I reached up and calmly peeled her fingers off my blazer. I smoothed the fabric out and looked her dead in the eye. I told her that the federal government does not care about her fake pregnancy. I told her that the FBI does not drop wire fraud charges just because the criminal has a crying wife. I told her that Terrence built his own cage and now he gets to sit in it. I turned away from her, completely dismissing her existence. A catering waiter was standing frozen right next to me, holding a silver tray with a few remaining crystal champagne flutes. The poor kid looked completely terrified by the federal raid happening in the middle of his shift. I gave the waiter a polite smile and gently reached out to take a fresh glass of champagne from his tray. I turned back around, holding the crystal flute in my hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive imported champagne. The crisp, cold liquid tasted exactly like absolute victory. I stood there perfectly relaxed, drinking my champagne and watching with cold satisfaction as the federal agents forcefully marched Terrence across the marble floor and out the heavy mahogany front doors toward the waiting police cruisers. Desiree collapsed onto the floor, sobbing hysterically into her hands, completely ignored by the wealthy investors who were now rapidly rushing out the door to avoid being questioned by the remaining local police officers. The massive grand foyer began to clear out. The jazz music was completely gone. The loud, confident chatter of the real estate seminar was replaced by the chaotic sounds of police radios and the slamming of cruiser doors outside. The flashing red and blue lights continued to reflect across the beautiful house I had built. I lowered my champagne glass and let out a long breath. The war was officially over. I had successfully defended my empire and eradicated the parasite that had been draining my family for years. I prepared to set my glass down and walk away from this toxic mess forever. But as the crowd of fleeing investors thinned out, I saw my parents standing alone near the catering tables at the back of the room. Reverend Thomas and Brenda were completely frozen in place. The devastating reality of what had just transpired had fully settled into their minds. They had watched Terrence, the man they worshipped, be exposed as a federal criminal. They had watched him be dragged away in handcuffs for attempting to steal their home and drain their pension. And they had watched me, the daughter they had abused, neglected, and cast aside, orchestrate the precise surgical strike that saved their financial lives. The cognitive dissonance in their brains had finally resolved into a state of pure, crushing, agonizing guilt. My father looked at me. His arrogant pastoral pride was completely gone. His shoulders were slumped and he looked incredibly fragile. He realized that if I had listened to him in the study, if I had backed down and played the role of the obedient, silent daughter, he would currently be facing absolute financial ruin. He realized that the secular corporate monster he had just screamed at was the only reason he still had a roof over his head. My mother stood next to him, wiping her tear-stained face with a napkin. She looked at me with an expression of profound regret that I had never seen her wear before. She realized that she had literally dropped to her knees and begged me to let a criminal destroy her life just to protect Desiree's fragile ego. They both realized simultaneously that they had treated their savior like absolute garbage just minutes prior. They slowly stepped away from the catering table. They moved together, walking cautiously across the marble floor toward me. Their hands were slightly outstretched. Their faces were twisted into masks of desperate apology. They were preparing to beg for my forgiveness. They were preparing to tell me how wrong they had been and how incredibly grateful they were that I had protected the family. They were about to try and pull me back into their toxic web using gratitude instead of guilt. But they had absolutely no idea that I was completely done playing their games. My mother reached out her arms, preparing to embrace me. My father had tears streaming down his face, ready to deliver a grand speech about family redemption. Before they could touch me, I held up my hand. I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor and told them to stop exactly where they were. They froze, looking at my hand as if it were a weapon. My mother lowered her arms, her face crumbling into an expression of profound sorrow. She whispered my name, begging me to let them thank me. She said they finally realized how blind they had been, and that they owed me their entire lives. I took a sip of my champagne and shook my head. I told them they did not owe me anything because I did not do this to save them. I did this to protect my own company. I looked around the beautiful grand foyer, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the sweeping staircase. I told my parents to take a very good look at this house. I told them to admire the imported marble floors and the custom details. I reminded them that I had mailed them the keys to this exact address a week ago. I looked my father in the eyes and revealed the final piece of the puzzle. I told him that I did not buy this $3 million lakefront mansion as a corporate headquarters. I built this estate specifically for them. It was supposed to be my grand surprise for their 30th wedding anniversary. It was supposed to be their peaceful retirement home, paid for in full by the daughter they always looked down upon. My mother's knees buckled slightly and she gasped. The sheer weight of what she had just lost finally hit her. I told them that the house was officially theirs the moment they received those keys. But instead of trusting me, they handed those keys directly to a con artist. They hid in a dark study and tried to guilt me into surrendering my wealth to fund his fake lifestyle. I told them that because they proved they would always sacrifice me to protect Desiree, the offer was permanently revoked. I set my empty champagne flute on a nearby catering table. I told them both to immediately leave my house and never contact me again, ever. 6 months have passed since that chaotic afternoon. The fallout from the federal raid was absolute and permanent. Terrence did not even try to take his case to trial. Faced with a mountain of undeniable digital evidence and multiple federal charges, he quickly took a plea deal. He is currently serving 10 years in a federal penitentiary. His fake empire was completely liquidated to pay massive restitution to banks and contractors. When investigators dug into his finances, they discovered he had secretly taken out dozens of high-interest credit cards in Desiree's name. Because they were legally married, she was held entirely responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden debt. The golden child was forced to file for personal bankruptcy. Her designer wardrobe and leased luxury cars were completely repossessed. Today, Desiree works full-time at a discount retail clothing store just to make her minimum payments. Her wealthy sorority sisters and her elite church friends completely shunned her the moment the scandal hit the local news. She is now a social outcast living in a tiny rented apartment, entirely alone. As for my parents, they did not lose their physical home, but they lost absolutely everything else. The details of Terrence's criminal scheme and my father's foolish involvement became the biggest gossip in their entire community. The church elders were absolutely appalled that their senior pastor had recklessly gambled his pension and nearly bankrupted his family to support a scam artist. My father was quietly forced into early retirement to avoid a massive public scandal. He and my mother now spend their days isolated in their old colonial house, carrying the heavy, suffocating shame of their public humiliation. They occasionally try to send me emails or leave voicemails begging for a second chance, but I delete them all without listening to a single second. I chose a completely different path. I did not sell the $3 million lakefront mansion. I kept the property and completely repurposed it. I transformed the massive estate into an exclusive corporate retreat and networking hub specifically designed for Black women in high-level corporate finance. Where Terrence once tried to host a fake seminar to steal my wealth, I now host legitimate quarterly summits where brilliant women gather to share investment strategies and build genuine generational wealth. I walk through the grand foyer now, and I do not feel any lingering sadness or bitter resentment. I only feel the immense power of my own independence. Cutting off my family was the hardest but most necessary decision of my entire life. We are taught from a very young age that blood means unconditional loyalty. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share the same genetics. But family is not a free pass to exploit your hard work. You cannot build an empire if you are constantly allowing toxic people to drill holes in your foundation. Protecting your peace and your wealth requires setting absolute boundaries, even if it means walking away from the people who raised you. Sometimes the only way to win is to let the illusion shatter and leave the broken pieces exactly where they fall. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who raised you? Let me know in the comments below. If my journey resonated with your personal experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Share this story with anyone who needs the courage to stand up to toxic family members and reclaim their own worth. Thank you all so very much for listening and joining me on this incredibly powerful journey today.